Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we are having the next in our series, People, Politics, and Prose, moderated by our very own Ron Granieri, who is FPRI's executive director of the Center for the Study of the West, of America and the West. And he is also the host of this series. He'll be speaking with Professor John Mueller about Professor Mueller's new book, The Stupidity of War, American Foreign Policy in the Case for Complacency. This is a follow-on to a book talk that Ron did earlier, and maybe 2 or 3 months ago, with Professor Margaret Macmillan, who's an Oxford historian, who discussed her book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. So we're getting a couple of different views here. Ron Granieri, as I mentioned, is the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. He's also a Templeton Fellow and Templeton Education Fellow for FPRI. He is the author of The Ambivalent Alliance, Konrad Adenauer, the CDU, CSU, and the West. And he's currently working on a book, The Fall and Rise of German Christian Democracy from Détente to Reunification, for the Oxford University Press. He's also a professor of history currently at the U.S. Army War College. I also am obliged to make the disclaimer that Ron's comments here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. They are his own. And I would also reiterate that FPRI is nonpartisan, and any comments here by our guests and our moderator are their own and don't reflect any institutional positions by FPRI. Finally, I'd like to thank those of you who are our supporters and our members, and for those of you who aren't, please consider becoming a member or a supporter of FPRI. We need your support. We can't do this without you. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron Granieri. Take it away, Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. It's a pleasure to have you with us. In its most dynamic aspects, American military policy during the current century has been an abject and highly destructive failure. Misguided and unnecessary, that is, stupid, wars of aggression and occupation have been launched in which trillions of dollars have been squandered and well over 200,000 people have perished, including more than twice as many Americans as were killed on 9/11. That is a quote from Professor John Mueller in his new book, The Stupidity of War, a lively and provocative reinterpretation of American policy since 1945. Asserting that American leaders have consistently overestimated military threats and underestimated the costs of military adventures, Professor Mueller claims the world would have been at least as peaceful and perhaps even better off if Washington had pursued a more modest international course. Attributing post-war international stability to a general decline in the impulse to major war, rather than to any American strategic wisdom, Professor Mueller argues the United States could contribute to future peace by pivoting away from large forces in being and from overseas bases toward a policy of strategic complacency so that, quote, a sense of humility may come to crowd out arrogance, unquote. Here, of course, we reach a paradox at the heart of a work that otherwise revels in paradoxes. There are few poses more arrogant, after all, than asserting that everyone else is stupid, just as it can be problematic to claim that because calamities for which one prepared didn't happen, they were never going to happen at all, and therefore the preparations were all unnecessary. There's much to criticize about American policy over the past 75 years, but is it necessary to combat one extreme by embracing the other? From claiming to be surrounded by enemies to announcing that we never really had nor are likely to have any enemies at all. Have American policy leaders overemphasized the military aspects of national security? Why? How exactly would a policy of strategic complacency look? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Professor John Mueller. Professor Mueller is an adjunct professor of political science and senior research scientist at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. Senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he is also the author of, among many other works, Retreat from Doomsday: The Obsolescence of Major War. Welcome to People, Politics, and Prose, Professor Mueller.
Thank you. Very great to be here.
So how did this particular book come to be? I made a point of commenting on Retreat from Doomsday because you have been arguing in one way or another about long-term trends in war. Where do you see this work as fitting into your larger academic?
Well, it's a clear follow-up, as I point out on initially in an early page. I wrote A Retreat from Doomsday in 1989, and the subtitle is The Obsolescence of Major War. A major war being defined as war among developed states. And at that point, it was pretty clear that World War III was not exactly going to happen anytime soon. And so this is a really amazing phenomenon. For example, Evan Luard in 1986, in a book looking at wars over the last 5 or 8 centuries, says that the discontinuity in Europe of not having a war for that long a time in 1986 was totally unprecedented, one of the greatest change perhaps in the history of warfare. So I was arguing basically that it seemed to be that the major countries had decided not to use war. They had plenty of problems, but not use war to decide them, but to deal with their differences. But at the same time, there were a lot of other international wars. In fact, I was writing the book during perhaps the worst international war since World War II, the one between Iran and Iraq that took place pretty much for the full decade of the 1980s. And I sort of speculated at that time in 1989 that, well, a lot of wars don't seem to be happening even outside of the developed world. For example, Israel and the Arab states have not got into an international war since 1973. And Egypt and India and Palestine and Pakistan have gotten into a lot of wars, but none since the early 70s as well. Maybe there's the whole. And more or less, that's proven to be the case. Essentially, in the last 30 years, there's been only 3 international wars defined as armed conflicts in which at least there's 1,000 battle deaths in a year. One was between Ethiopia and Eritrea at the end of the last century. The other 2 were the brief wars by the United States against the Taliban and against Saddam Hussein, which then, of course, degenerated into long wars of occupation. So what seems to me is happening is, in the conclusion to this book, is we've gotten into a situation of sort of a culture of peace in which international war is not used as a way of solving problems, pretty much. And I think that trend is likely to continue. That doesn't mean everything is ideal. They use there's constant conflicts over borders, for example, that don't go to war. For example, China and India just had a bad case of that just last year. There's also economic sanctions. There's also intervening in other civil wars. There's lobbing cyber balloons. And so there's a whole series of things which countries do, but none of them are escalating into international war. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then they can try to work out their problems, sometimes with a bit of economic or political or other distress, but not with the use of the ultimate weapon, which is an international war. So I think there's a chance this process is going to continue, and that the change of attitude toward war, which I think caused this, will perpetuate it into the future.
And this is one of the interesting points that you argue in the book and in your other work as well, is that this reluctance to go to war is not necessarily the product of classical deterrence, the way that it is often discussed. And yet it's a little unclear to me, and maybe you could explain to me and to the audience as well. So where did this resistance or this reluctance to go to war come from? Is it because people are afraid of where war can lead, or is it part of some larger human path towards enlightenment?
Well, I'm not sure I want to go as far as enlightenment, but since I'm in favor of peace, I guess I should embrace that. The turning point quite clearly was World War I. Mm-hmm. It's quite amazing when I looked into this, particularly for Retreat from Doomsday. If you look back at writings before World War I, It's incredibly easy to find people saying war is beautiful, glorious, progressive, redemptive, clean, cleansing, et cetera, not just by Prussian militarists, but by poets and artists and art critics and journalists and historians. And calling peace the opposite. You know, one historian called it peace is bovine content, that it's regressive, that it's effeminate, that it stifles innovation, et cetera. It brings out pure selfishness and things like that. So just reading through a journal, paging through a journal called 19th Century, which was a 19th century journal, basically an intellectual journal, so like the Hudson Review or something like that. And you come across an article written by a theologian. They called God's Purpose by War. So you got this theologian telling you how great and wonderful and necessary and holy war was. Mm-hmm. Well, after World War II, after World War I, you can't find that at all. I've looked pretty hard, maybe one or two cases where it pops up. So there's a major change. And basically what happened after World War I, it seems to me, was an idea that let's not do that anymore. World War I was very destructive, but there have been a lot of destructive wars. It was just an idea whose time seems to have come. World War II, needless to say, got in the way, and I'll talk about that if you'd like. But then the quest was rejuvenated after World War II, and I think it is held. Essentially now, we've been living for 75 years with major war among developed states. And it centered particularly on Europe, where that change really heavily took place. And Europe is now in peace, free from international war, significant international war. Now, for the longest period of time, as far as I can see, since the word was invented, Europe was invented as a word about 2,500 years ago. So what I'm arguing is we ought to celebrate that, or if you like war, of course, it's big. You wouldn't celebrate it, but I think most of them are not in that camp, and see it as very significant. And it seems to me that basically the change has been from going toward a revulsion toward war, a change of attitude about war, not about because it became more destructive or more stupid. World War I is very stupid, but if you want to find a stupid war, it's not hard going back. Check out the War of 1812. Check out the Greek and Trojan War, fought over 10 years, fought over an errant wife, ended up with the total demolition of Troy. Stupidity is not new in warfare. I think it's new that people thought it was stupid, but basically as a really organized movement, it really only flowered after World War I.
Well, before we go on, I wanted to say to our listeners, we will, of course, we always welcome your questions. Please post your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom rather than the chat box. It's easier for us to keep track of questions that way, so please keep that in mind. I wanted to, since it's part of your book is offers a sort of historical survey, and then you have an analysis of current events. But if I wanted to, with the historical survey, the idea that you can really see that difference between the way war is talked about, say, in 1912, 1913 versus, say, 1919 or 1920. And yet the Second World War happens anyway. And to try to figure out, where does this fit into this larger notion? You do point out, and I'll say as a Germanist, very truly, that there's remarkable little enthusiasm, public enthusiasm for war in 1939, at least certainly compared to the enthusiasm that's shown in 1914. But you didn't need public enthusiasm, apparently, to start the war. And so how do we explain, is it that the Second World War was essentially dealing with issues that had been left unresolved by the first one, and the Europeans needed to fight that out and get that out of their system before they could be sure they didn't want to have any more wars?
Yeah, I'm not sure. In the case of World War II, Japan was not part of this consensus. You could still find the old war system in Japan. Needless to say, they learned their lesson in World War II.
Sure.
And as near as I can tell, there's nobody, in fact, let me quote John Keegan, the great military historian, only one European wanted war, and that was Adolf Hitler. Now, in one sense, that's reassuring because it took basically an extremely well-positioned guy who was extremely talented and extremely lucky to pull that off. On the other hand, despite all this anti-war feeling, it was possible for someone to do that. So the problem with the change of attitude argument that people hate is that there's no reason why they can't change back again. But had major institutions which had died, namely formal slavery. I mean, when they first, at the end of the 18th century, they started talking about, people started saying, let's not do slavery anymore. And they thought, you're crazy. It's been there, it's in the Bible, whatever, on and on and on. Some people are born to be masters and some people are born to be slaves. That's the way it is. It's human nature. And in a century, it died out, and there's no sign that it's come back as a formal institution. Maybe as a criminal institution sometimes, but not as a formal one. So things can go away and not come back. I don't see the likely rise of the bustle either, but I don't want to trivialize the argument. Or the formal duel, which would be close to war in many respects. You don't see young men of that social set that used to duel saying, swords or pistols at 20 paces already. They just don't even think about it. Right. It could come back. There's no physical reason why it couldn't go back. It could also come back as legally, like if you did a duel with boxing gloves. But it doesn't seem, so things do go away and disappear completely. So that may be the case with international war as well.
Right, maybe, and that's where it gets very interesting. The argument that you're making, right, is that war may be stupid, maybe obsolete, maybe obsolescent, at least if not obsolete, but international competition is still there. And so, how do you see international relations progressing in a way as states pursue their interests, regional, global, local? How do we see them pursuing those interests, even engaging in competition while still staying on this side of that border with major international war?
Well, they've been doing it pretty well.
Yeah.
There's plenty of competition in the world, and that's extremely likely to continue, obviously. But they're carrying it out without using war. So there's lots of little pieces of land that have been taken over by one country or another. And nothing's basically happened. And let me get this. It's my phone.
That's all right.
Well, that's gone. There's various other ways to carry it out. Economic sanctions are not painless. Mm-hmm. Intervening in civil wars is not painless. Fighting over fishing rights is not painless. And meanwhile, there's, of course, this sort of a society saying we won't use war to solve our differences. We will have some altercations, but by definition, what a war is, they're not wars. Killing 3 people at a border station is not a war. It may be very regrettable. We may encourage terrorism and have sub-state groups sort of carry things out, so that they can continue to compete at that level. But they're not competing by killing each other in massive international conflagrations. The competition depends what you want to compete for, and mostly what people are competing for is becoming more prosperous. And that's something they can do and lead together pretty well. And in fact, that has been very successful. That's astounding economic growth over the last 150 years or so, and particularly over the last 50. Almost, except maybe for a dozen cases, looking at things from before the COVID thing in 2019, probably except for a dozen cases, every country in the world, the standard of living in those countries is better than it's ever been before in all of history, including Russia and China. So it's a kind of a golden age in that sense of progress. People are competing. If they want to compete over who's got the best COVID vaccine, that's just fine with me. And if they sometimes get a little even rough, if there's a certain amount of spying, if there's a certain amount of espionage, if there's a certain amount of sabotage and so forth, I think that's something we can deal with pretty well. And anyway, it's vastly preferable to the cataclysm of international war.
Certainly. Well, and this is an interesting paradox also that I saw in your book, is because you do talk about this idea of if we're competing, or if we focus on economic development, then we are cooperating, and that is better. So in a certain sense, there is an element of domestic development, changes in attitudes, changes in outlook can lead to a more peaceful world. But you are very suspicious of the democratic peace theory, that somehow being a democracy makes you more peaceful. How do you split that difference?
Well, the country, the Soviet Union didn't want to go to international war. Mm-hmm. And it certainly wasn't a democracy, nor did China particularly, and nor did many other dictatorships. So it's not clear you have to be democratic to do it. Mm-hmm. What it seems to me is, and I developed this very much most extensively toward the end of the book, is that if everybody agrees basically not to go to war, that's facilitating. It's in the case of democracy, it means that, well, if we're not going to go to war with somebody, maybe we don't need that thug who's been leading us, because we don't need a strong man on top. In the case of trade, it's very much the case. You know, if I'm going to go to war with another country, and my country's going to go to war with another country in the next 20 years, I'm going to be pretty wary about investing in that country or buying or selling from that country. If I can say, well, this will be the way it is, let's go over and see if they have something to sell or buy, they can do it. So peace is facilitating in that sense. Mm-hmm. And let me give you one sort of specific example. Some people have argued that the peace between France and Germany since World War II was caused by international trade or democracy or American hegemony or the Pax Americana and so forth. To which I would argue then, okay, well, why don't you find me somebody in France, somebody in Germany, who got up on a soapbox or rose drunkenly from a park bench even, anybody, it doesn't have to be a politician, who has said the following: you know, we're really smart people here in France, really smart people in Germany. And over the centuries, they've used this intelligence to get into wars with each other, and they're a colossal success. You know, let's renew the venerable tradition. Let's go back and do that again. And I think you'd have trouble finding anybody who said that. So the idea that they haven't got into wars with each other is because of these other things is very strained, it seemed to me. Let me give you another example, which is often used as a prime example. In 1950, a Frenchman with a German name, Robert Schuman, decided that in order to keep France and Germany from going to war with each other, what they should do is integrate their economies with the coal and steel community. And he made it very explicit. The reason for that was not, but because he wanted to prevent war. So they made the coal and steel community, and of course eventually evolved into the common market and to the European Union. Very beneficial development. But it seems to me that they didn't need that. I mean, if there's no Frenchman, no German thinking about going to war with each other, it affords an opportunity to forge these things. It's not that the trade between France and Germany caused them to not want to go to war. It's the feeling they didn't want to go to war facilitated their peacefulness. You know, basically in Philadelphia and other places, people drive on the right side of the street. Now, no one says, as I say, people ride. The reason people are afraid of being killed by oncoming traffic is because they're required to drive on the right-hand side of the street. Everybody would say, I think. People have an aversion to being killed by oncoming traffic. They had to work out a deal, pick one side or the other, and stick with it, and we're in pretty good shape. That the occasional drunk drives on the wrong side of the street doesn't demonstrate the fallacy of that assumption. So it seems trade, democracy, Pax Americana, and so forth, we're all possibly facilitated. We're there, but they're basically developed. The underlying cause was basically an aversion to international war.
But at the same time, right, as somebody who studies both Germany and France and the decision to create the European Union in the 1950s, I'm struck by your story. Well, it downplays the fact that within France itself, politically, there was a great deal of resistance to what Schuman presented for many years, in part by people who said we still can't trust the Germans, that it required significant political toing and froing. It required the creation, let's say, maybe we get away from required, but let's say that it was accompanied by the creation of a larger security scaffolding, let's say, that allowed the French, encouraged the French to put aside some of their concerns. And that scaffolding included the NATO alliance. It included the Marshall Plan, which provided, and other American assistance. That these things did, it doesn't seem quite right to just claim that people did decide after 1945 that they had enough of going to war and that this other stuff didn't matter. And I realize this is what happens with a lot of academic arguments. I've had enough of them. I'm sure you have too, where ultimately one starts by making very clear distinctions, and in the end, in the discussion, you have to sort of muddle them a little bit. But this idea that you are very skeptical in your book and in your writings about the value of American participation in the development of European peace after 1945. And yet, is it correct to say that the United States and that the decisions by the United States to play a more active role, to station troops in Germany as a way both to provide security for the Germans, but also to provide the French with a guarantee that they weren't going to be left alone on the continent with them, does this not contribute to this more peaceful world?
Yeah, and I'm willing to concede that I do in the book, that it certainly played a role, helped with some stability here and there. And the general feeling of getting together, the French and the Germans had a lot of lessons to relearn, and they certainly learned that they were no longer the threat to each other that they once did before. So having nice agreements and blending coal and steel was there, and there were also people opposed to it, socialists from an economic standpoint.
And the Gaullists opposed it too.
But pardon?
And the Gaullists opposed it too for many years.
Yeah, from an economic standpoint, if you said that to Schuman, what he'd say is, I don't care whether it's economically sensible or not. I'm doing it to facilitate peace. I think it played a role, but it's not as if you got a whole bunch of warmongers who want to go to war that are being stifled. What it is a bunch of people who just want to be more reassured. One of the things, as you mentioned, is, of course, NATO, and the United States played a role in that, and it's really helped encourage integration, both within NATO and within the common market. And I think that's fine. But it seems to me what would basically have happened, things would have turned out pretty much the same if it hadn't done very much on that. In the case of NATO, it seems increasingly clear as we get more and more evidence from the Soviet archives that they never in a million years wanted to attack Western Europe, much less the United States. They said this repeatedly, but very few people took them seriously for a long time, partly because they had a very antagonistic ideology. They clearly wanted to take over Western Europe, clear from every book and pamphlet and bumper sticker that this would be done by revolutionary civil war, by class warfare if there's going to be violence at all, and by subversion and things like that. So they did not see international war as a method for doing that. So it seems to me that NATO was not needed, and I've got a fair amount of evidence on this in the book, that there was no war to deter. The Soviet Union never in a million years wanted to get it anywhere close to that. Khrushchev said that. Stalin said that. People who were in the Defense Department. And what you have to do, I mean, obviously you could say, well, that, as you sort of suggested earlier, that they did it because there was this big deterrent out there. That they didn't think seriously about war. And that's a good argument. Except that what you have to do is find somebody somewhere who said, oh, damn, if they didn't have those nuclear weapons, we really could have a really great war in Europe, whatever. Maybe we sneak in and take over the rest of Germany or something like that. And it was and you basically can't find people like that. What they say repeatedly, we never talked about anything except defending ourselves in case we were attacked by NATO. And I think, so the ball was in the court of the people who think that there were people who really would have gone to war. Massive catastrophe of that war in the Second World War. Let me give you one example. One of the people who really, not very many people said what I just said during the war. Kennan did some, Bernard Brody, a defense analyst, did. But the guy I'm most interested in is Dwight Eisenhower. And what he said was, in his memoirs, he talks about flying to meet Stalin right after World War II in Moscow. So they had their meeting. He was, of course, head of the, at that time, the head of the Allied forces, top general. And then he's flying back to Berlin, and they're flying low enough or without any clouds or something, and he can look down for the full 1,000-mile flight. And he looked down and said, everything is destroyed. And then he said, they're not going to do that again. And he really strongly believed that. He was not willing really to say it in public because it sounded sort of wishy-washy, I suppose, or pro-communist or something. Instead, he blamed everything on the military-industrial complex. But what he didn't blame it on, what he should have, is on the premise that gave the military-industrial complex so much clout, which was that people believed their argument about this, the Ruskies were going to come over to go Fulda Gap in the next 20 minutes. So fear-mongering of that sort can be successful, but that doesn't mean it's valid.
Well, and that gets to a question. Well, there are two questions I want to make sure that I ask. I'll start with the second one, just based on what you just described there, and that is, if we are talking about a lack of, if your argument is that the threats are generally overplayed consistently, why?
Why? Yeah, well.
Why? I mean, what would you say? Because if, let's say, because we could also talk about, you do have a habit in the book, which I got to say, whatever one thinks about the argument, whether one agrees with you or not, the book is a lot of fun to read. You make a lot of you're fantastically clever at when you talk about vast claims and then half vast actions. I think that's a very funny turn of phrase at one point. But you do have a habit basically of writing it as though nobody ever threatened the United States ever. Even when you talk about the contemporary world, you refer to Russian actions in Ukraine, you refer to Iranian actions in the Middle East as antics. You say that Chinese behavior in Western China is particularly graceless. You say that the American hostages in Iran were placed under a kind of house arrest. That there is let's say a pattern in which the threats are never very big. They're never very real. They're always less than people said they were at the time, which legitimate point of view, but it raises two questions. One is, do you really believe that there never were any threats at all? But even more so, if there really never were any threats, how do we explain American policy? I mean, are you just saying that it's all about stupidity and venality? What exactly is the motivation here, if we accept your premise that there never was any threat to begin with?
Yeah, my thinking on this in particular started with the threat of terrorism after 9/11, and I did a book called Overblown, arguing that the threat of terrorism has been massively exaggerated. I think I was right. Right now, I think Al-Qaeda is basically comparable to Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who killed John Kennedy, a fundamentally trivial entity that got horribly lucky once. And so then I was also looked at all the other threats, and particularly since World War II, and argued that they'd been inflated in various ways. Not that taking them seriously was wrong, but basically the counter argument was virtually never, like Eisenhower saying they're not going to attack us. And why isn't it that you may not agree with that, but that's a perfectly plausible argument. I mean, they went through World War II. They mainly based on class warfare and stuff like that. They don't do that again. But it wasn't really on the agenda, just everybody's assumption. My main concern is the militarization. I do think the communists posed a threat. The threat was basically subversion, class warfare, supporting revolutionary wars. In other words, they were going to expand. And I think that part of the Cold War, which the argument was used for containment, was there. But what they weren't going to use is direct warfare. And my concern is that this massive militarization of the idea of trying to hold them back, which I think is much exaggerated. In general, I'm definitely, you're absolutely right, of course, that I tend to see threats inflated. I was just reading Mitt Romney's, just had a thing, or somebody wrote it for him in the Washington Post like a week ago. He's saying China is a threat because it's getting really rich, because it's building up its military. And they're also doing bad things inside. I mean, like, suppressing civil liberties and stuff like that. But why are those threats? I mean, those are, it's going to get big no matter what. Its goals seem to be overwhelmingly to play a bigger role on the international stage. Why not? Let them do it. They deserve it. That's fine. They would be a part of the game. Be nice to have them help with Afghanistan, for example, because they don't like Islamic extremism any more than we do. And the other thing is to continue becoming more prosperous, maybe building up more navy, but they don't seem to have any territorial ambitions, Hitler-like, except, of course, for the potential with respect to Taiwan. The Russians seem to be basically the same. After Crimea, which has mostly stumbled into in various ways, and in many respects is facilitated by the chaos in Ukraine proper, there was a lot of concern that the Soviet Union or Russia would follow similar patterns of helping Russian large minorities in places like Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. And that basically didn't happen. It seems to me they too also want to play a role in the world. There's lots of policies they do we don't like, some of them economic, many of them political. We could certainly protest about that, but those are not threats. There are a lot of countries that have bad civil liberties records, bad humanitarian records, and we should be definitely concerned about that, but they don't constitute a threat to the United States, particularly a military security type threat, which is mostly what I've been worried about.
And so the idea is global warming. Like global warming, right? Something that threatens.
Yeah, global warming, refugees, pandemics, if you want to call those threats, I generally prefer just security threats, military security threats, and want to call them something else. That doesn't mean they're not important. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're not caused by another country or anything in general.
Right. Well, and this is, you know, to think about future policy and going forward, right? That you make a claim in the book, which I think fits in with what you were just saying, that the United States needs to distinguish between what appears to be sort of relatively rational, if not inevitable actions, and shouldn't get hung up in names. We shouldn't be worried about regional hegemons, for example, right? You say that that political scientists should get rid of the term hegemon from their glossaries, because we need to stop worrying about the fact that a state might want to have preponderant interest in an area nearby, because that's perfectly natural. And so that raises the question of, you know, how should the United States react to when people talk about the emergence of multipolarity, for example, when they talk about the idea that there may be multiple regional hegemons. How should the United States approach, according to your work, how should the United States approach those kinds of changes in an international system, where the United States may have to recognize that it does not have the same unlimited coming and going rights that it may have thought that it had back before there was a regional hegemon to oppose the United States?
Yeah, well, as you say, I have a lot of trouble with the word hegemon because I don't even know what it means. And it's not clear that people use it a lot really know what it means. It tends to mean in ordinary English that basically you can slap people around and they'll do what you say and so forth. We've been slapping Cuba around for 60 years, and I haven't noticed that policy has changed very much. In general, the subtitle of the book, in fact, it was originally to be in the title, was the case for complacency. And it just seems to me that during the Cold War, for example, complacency would have been better than building up this massive military force to deter a threat that didn't exist. Complacency would have been better with Vietnam because what that did was cause like 2 million people to die, and the communists won anyway. After the Cold War, it seems to me even more complacent attitude toward Afghanistan, for example. You'd still want to do something after 9/11. But taking down a regime that had nothing to do with 9/11 was not probably the right way to do it, and certainly turned out to be very costly. The same with the war in Iraq, which I was very much opposed to from the beginning. In the case of China, I just finished a paper, by the way, just published today, in fact, at Cato website, called China, Rise or Demise. And it expands the section in the book quite substantially. And as far as I see, there's nothing we can do. We can protest. We can deal warily. If we want to worry about them stealing intellectual secrets, we can make sure the secrets are more carefully watched. If they commit sabotage, we want to deal with that, but they don't do that. They seem to be more interested in stealing secrets and things like that. We certainly don't like the things that's going on inside the country in terms of civil liberties, and both in terms of political civil liberties, as with Hong Kong and with the Uyghurs, but also economically. They're making a lot of mistakes. They're basically freezing up the economy, pumping tons of money into money-losing operations like the state-owned enterprises, not letting the free market go. They should be liberalizing, and they're doing the opposite. And there's not a whole lot we can do about that. They are going to grow probably less well in the future. People may protest, but there's no way you can change it. So you want to deal with it. You got this country that has civil liberties like a lot of other countries that we don't like. We should take cognizance of that. They're going to grow. They're going to be an even greater economic power. And if that works to our advantage, we should buy and sell to them. If it doesn't, don't. And the same with Russia, basically. Russia seems to be not on an aggressive path. It wants to swing more weight. I would strongly advocate, in the case of Syria, trying to work with the Russians to stabilize the situation in Syria. Assad is essentially won. There was a humanitarian catastrophe of monumental proportions, partly because of the interference from outside forces, largely, in fact. And it seems to me now that putting that back together, even if Assad is the winner, is better than returning to a condition of what we've got now, or even worse, more civil war. So why not bring the Russians in? They have an interest. Maybe it won't work, but it might. So complacency, I certainly want to remain engaged, but it seems to me that militarized policy, there's no way you can stop China from becoming richer with military policy. I mean, they're just going to do it. We shouldn't exaggerate how rich they are. In terms of per capita income, they're about number 78 They don't even count officially as being a developed country yet. But they're growing. When you mentioned the word rationality, and I think that the root of China's problems is that they're incredibly rational, and they've made a decision. What we want to do is keep the kleptocratic Communist Party in control, even if economic growth slackens. In other words, economic growth is not as important. It's a very rational decision from their standpoint, because we want to keep bilking the country. We want to keep stealing from banks. We want to keep it sashaying around. And so if we grow less, that's unfortunate perhaps, but much more important is keeping the Communist Party in control. Hence policies, historical policies toward Xinjiang and toward Hong Kong. I think those are mistakes, but they're rational mistakes in the sense that they figure out what they care about more. Right. And I go over there and say, no, you got that wrong. The Communist Party should go away. That's not going to be a big selling argument overall. Well, and as I say, there's no way, certainly militarily, you can stop a country from growing. And if it keeps growing, in many respects, that's good for us. Right.
Well, and this, I think, to get at a source, I'm sure, of a lot of debate about your book and about your work is you argue for let's say a largely demilitarized foreign policy, but you still advocate for engagement with the world, right? So complacency does not mean disengagement.
Absolutely not.
But how would you conceive, like, let's imagine, right? You're retired now, so you have a lot of time on your hands. And so you get to be Secretary of State. What does an American foreign policy look like that is complacent but engaged?
But well, those would be the two. We don't have to over exaggerate threats, because there aren't threats. Things like global warming and things like that before. We don't, and they, in particular, insofar as there are any security threats, they don't seem to be big enough or severe enough to require this huge military we have. And it can be massively pared down. Grudgingly have a chapter about hedging. Right. Suppose I'm wrong.
It's always good to be prepared for that possibility.
Right. And so what should he do? Well, it seems we should keep in the wildly unlikely idea that there might be another Hitler rising someplace. There's no physical reason that can't happen. We should probably keep some nuclear weapons. We should keep some rapid reaction forces. We should certainly beef up a capacity to rebuild if we build our military down and suddenly realize that was a mistake. That's kind of grudging on my part, but I think that's not reasonable. That's quite reasonable. Instead, what we're doing is throwing more and more money at the military. I just ran across something. One of the things that people are worried about a lot. It's not in the book because I only found out recently, but it is in my paper that just came out today. Someone has pointed out that the amount of money being spent by the Chinese on their supposedly threatening Belt and Road Initiative, in which they're building infrastructure around the world and so forth, trying to gain, quote, influence, unquote, is about the same amount as the United States will be spending in total on its development and deployment of its F-25 fighter, about $1.5 trillion over a period of time. That's sort of the game we're playing, the incredible amount of money going to that plane, and maybe some of it would be better spent elsewhere. So I basically don't think there are very many threats of any magnitude. They mostly are not of a military sort for the most part. And the other problems we can manage in a reasonable way. Mostly, if China is going to change, it's going to change from inside, as it did after the death of Mao, for example. That we can certainly applaud, but we can't cause it to happen. And the same basically with Putin and Russia.
Right. Well, and this is something that I've been wrestling with, having read your book and my own thinking about American foreign policy and the idea about why are threats exaggerated. One of the arguments that has been made, I shouldn't use the passive voice here, I've made this argument in casual conversation, but I think people have made it in scholarship as well, is that exaggerating threats is necessary. You quote Dean Acheson, sometimes you have to be clearer than truth, because the United States is a democracy, because the United States is a large continental state that might, in which a lot of citizens view foreign policy or engagement with the world as optional. And so that if the United States is going to be engaged, sometimes it is necessary in order to exaggerate threats in order to maintain that engagement or to get the American people's attention. It would be better, one could argue, if you could encourage people to think about engagement without having to talk about crises in order to do it. But do you see the exaggeration of threats as being a more or less permanent and inevitable feature of American policy? Or do you see it politically possible for American leaders to be able to explain the need that engagement does not require crises or gigantic threats?
Yeah, well, I think Eisenhower's lesson is salutary. He basically didn't think it was politically possible to say that. Barack Obama had the same thing with terrorism. And according to his staff at various times, he wanted to say the stuff I've been saying. Terrorism, it's not that big a deal. You know, your chance of being killed by a terrorist is about the same as being, is much smaller than a million other things, like dying in a bathtub and so forth. And he wanted to say that publicly. He did go so far as to say terrorism is not an existential threat. You know, congratulations. I mean, that's pretty minor. But he was afraid to go further on that. And the problem is that frequently fear sells. And consequently, the opposing party is going to use it to their advantage. So I'm not very optimistic that I'm going to be able to change that. What I want to stress, and people in international relations generally should spend a lot more time in threat assessment and threat exaggeration, because the United States is constantly exaggerating threats. Other countries do it too. For example, China has become apoplectic about the notion that Islamist terrorism could erupt in Xinjiang, in their far west. There are a bunch of Turks there, Turkish people, the Uyghurs. And so they've been suppressing them and going crazy, putting hundreds of thousands of them in prisons and then re-educating them, forcing them to watch videos from party leaders as if this is going to change them somehow. And most people look at it and say, there isn't much, they have had some problem with terrorism, but it's pretty minor. And the whole idea that province is going to secede and join Turkey or something is preposterous, but they're apoplectic about it. They were also about the trends in Hong Kong, which is why they cracked down, very costly for them. So it's not purely an American problem, I don't think. Other countries do it as well. And it's not, fear sells. Newspapers, get much more cash, and ratings go up on television if you can say, well, there was this terrorist event. Could ISIS be related? Because everybody's afraid of ISIS. So there's some nutcase in California throws a rock someplace and says, bravo to ISIS. And they say, wow, ISIS is on the march, and so that sells really big time. And so there is that basic proclivity. Some people argue it's hardwired. Steve Pinker, for example, at Harvard, that's sort of hardwired into the human condition, that people tend to exaggerate threats because that's safer than underplaying them. And that's maybe true. But nonetheless, the key thing from a standpoint of international politics, it seems to me, international relations, is get the threats right. And never take off the table a thing like Eisenhower, they're not going to attack. It may not be true, but unless you can refute it, any good intelligence officers should keep it on the table, but they basically don't do that.
Do you think, not just a matter of policy professionals, but policy scholars, do you think that the international relations as a discipline, especially those who call themselves realists, do they overemphasize do they tend to exaggerate threats because that's how they explain things, like that's how they talk about hegemons, that's how they discuss security dilemmas? You're very critical, even though somebody might look at your readings and see that you are a realist, but you're pretty critical of some very prominent capital R realists by saying that they tend to assume that everybody's going to fight, right? You quote, for example, Professor Mearsheimer's comments after 1990 that Germany would seek nuclear weapons because that's what structural realism would suggest, and the fact that they haven't might suggest that they're wrong. Do you think that we, in general, when we study international affairs, that we tend to we spend just too much time studying war and not enough time studying peace?
Well, probably. Obviously, worrying about getting into the next war is a legitimate thing, but maybe, as my general thesis is, maybe we relax on that a bit. I don't know. I've also been called a constructivist and a liberal and so forth, so I'm not sure.
Right.
I've been trying to figure out what realism is for about 40 years, and I gave up about 39 years ago, so I'm not going to go there. But the idea that China is going to become a hegemon and that somehow that's going to disrupt, I talk about that quite extensively, both in there and also in the China paper that I just published today. And I don't think it's valid that somehow they must be stopped. Or can't be stopped. I think realists generally are pretty good at wanting to identify the threats. They do think it is an important issue. And my argument would be, that's good and keep working on it. But I think in general, people should spend more time doing that. Let me take maybe a little bit on the Russian thing. Like a good complacent, I have about 6 items when I talk about Ukraine. And what a complacent person would do is say, forget it. Crimea is never going back to Ukraine. Crimea is going back to Ukraine about the same time Texas goes back to Mexico. It's over. It's done with. There's a lot of mistakes made. It was probably not a very good idea, et cetera, but they did vote on it and whatever. Live with it. Try to get from Putin, which I think would be very easily a non-aggression treaty. Try to get Ukraine's government to work on its monumental corruption problem. Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe, which is preposterous because it should be one of the best because it's got incredibly well endowed, both in terms of population, in terms of farmland and so forth. And because of corruption, it's a disaster. And they're working on it, but they should be encouraged to do more. Don't let them into NATO. That just scares the Russians. Maybe dangle European unity, European community membership down the road or something. But mostly just live with it. It's going to be there. Putin does not seem to want to expand in a military sense. He wants to have more sway maybe in his neighborhood. Not necessarily a bad thing. As I suggested, he should be brought in on the Syrian thing. So that's complacency, but it seems to be quite realistic. To use the word.
To use the word. Well, but the issue of, it's one thing to talk about Crimea, but what about the Donetsk and Luhansk, your provinces that are currently, seceding from Ukraine with Russian real and imagined support? What's the how can an international community push back against that without violating your notion of complacency?
I think they can basically working slowly, which you'd probably want to work at. Actually, Putin actually once proposed this, is having it sort of in a sort of Guantanamo type situation, or you'd have an international police force or something. Ukraine is actually economically better off without those impoverished provinces, also without Crimea for that matter. It was basically bailing out Crimea year after year. And the goal would be to basically have it be a sort of pretty much autonomous area, but under the sovereignty of Ukraine. I think that's a deal you could probably work out. Trying to do it with force, however, I think is a very bad idea. And the main way to do that would be to encourage and help, insofar as you can, Ukraine to get its act together. If it's a really wonderful country that everybody wants to be part of, you might get those guys coming back pretty fast. So that would be that's engagement. That's paying attention to what you can do. But it's not trying to do things you don't know how to do.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Please, we've only got about 5 minutes or so to go, unfortunately. But there are a couple questions coming in from the audience that I want to work into this conversation, if perhaps a little indirectly. And that is, one of the challenges whenever one talks about complacency or one talks about interests and sort of that idea that you just sort of let things happen that you can't change, right? Is it leaves the issue of let's say, right and wrong outside, right? The idea that, you know, some things you have to deal with, even though you know them to be wrong, or you would like to, or their activity that you don't want to encourage, but you have to decide whether you can stop it. Like, you know, Hank Cohen asked this question. You know, we could say that the American colonists provoked the American Revolution through the Boston Tea Party. If they had been more law-abiding types, maybe there wouldn't have been a revolution. But is that, in that sense, right? You know, if the American colonists had been more complacent, right, we'd still be drinking tea, and I wouldn't be drinking coffee out of my cup right now as we're talking. And is that a good thing? That's one part of it. And then Aishwarya Gupta asked a question about issues of exaggerating threats and misinformation. And I think about this too: is how should free societies live up to their sense of themselves, their sense of their responsibility to protect freedom, their own freedom, and perhaps at least to look pleasantly upon the freedom of others? How do we, you know, what do we do with questions of right and wrong, questions of morality? Are you saying we just leave them aside because there's nothing we can do about them? And what if?
The issue is not.
Go ahead.
What you want to do is not make them worse.
Not make them worse. All right, fair.
There's a lot of things you can't do. Saddam Hussein was a vicious dictator.
Mm-hmm.
Happened with that military invasion is things have gotten even worse. And the same, the Taliban was certainly not my idea of an ideal governing body, but the stability it foisted on, it established within Afghanistan was much better than the chaos that's happened since that time. The best leadership, you know, this is a terrible cliche, is basically the city on the hill sort of thing. I spent some time in East Europe in the early 90s because that was an extremely exciting time to be there as they were trying to make up their mind, you know, after the wall fell and which direction they were going. And the East European experience, by and large, was an astonishing success outside of obviously Yugoslavia, where there was a war. All those countries looked around and said, you know, the West is where it's at. We want to join the West. In some respects, it was really good. That's the best thing NATO ever did. If you join NATO, you can come to Brussels and drink martinis with us, the big guys. They loved that. I was in Slovakia, and Slovakia wanted to get there faster than the Czechs. That was competition. And so I think the incredible success, basically, of moving from communism to open democratic systems and open economies was that was the price to get into this desirable club, the common market, European Union, and NATO. And so I think that can be really good. You don't have to go around trying to do other things. There are a bunch of studies of covert efforts to try to change bad regimes by the United States. There have been dozens of them, and you had a program on this about a year ago about looking particularly at the Middle East. And the record about trying to change evil regimes is really terrible. Either it doesn't work at all, or it works, but then the guys you get after that are just as bad as the people you got out. And when in the few places where it did seem to work, it's pretty clear that would have happened anywhere. You know, they tried regime change in France, Italy, and Japan. In all cases, they're probably going that direction no matter what. So various efforts to try to manipulate things, the CIA involved and so forth, have often proven to be, you know, it's covert regime change has proven to be a major failure. There's some things you simply can't change. And it's basically hopeless. You can put your aura in, but sometimes putting your aura in only makes it worse. If you put your aura in on China will, and Russia, the same thing, blame any economic problems on the interfering Americans or the CIA or whatever. Right. If you're basically not there, they can't do that. The Cubans have been doing that forever, right? You know, I know things are miserable economically, but it's all the fault of the United States. And partly that's true, and partly that's an exaggeration. So it's not, unless you can really, basically the historical trends are going in a pretty good direction. I mentioned before about economic growth really astounding by historical standards. The vast majority of people in the world are better off than the people in those countries have ever been before. Democracy is also generally doing pretty well, though a bit of a slide back recently. In general, being in support of these conditions is a really good thing. There are bad moral things. One of the problems also about dealing with China is somehow we get really uptight about how they're treating the Uyghurs, but not how the Saudis are treating people in their countries and so forth. And the country is constantly being accused of hypocrisy, often justifiably. If it's bad there, why isn't it bad in Myanmar? Why is it bad in the Congo? And why is it only bad in China? And we should be wary of that. But generally, people, you can't poke people around. The regimes that see their survival at stake are not going to be manipulated by high-sounding rhetoric coming from the outside. That doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean that there's not a moral problem. But frequently, you can't change problems. You can't change things from the outside, and they should cool it and wait and try to be a good example.
Try to be a good example. That, I guess, that is both that is realistic and optimistic, and a little liberal and a little constructivist and a lot of other things too. And I guess that's a good place for us to end this conversation, because unfortunately our hour is up. Professor John Mueller, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, The Stupidity of Major War is available in bookstores now from Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much, Professor Mueller, for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for the sharp questions. I really enjoyed the session.
You bet. It was a lot of fun. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. FPRI would like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support. We thank all of you for joining us on Zoom, and we also hope that you may consider wanting to become one of those generous sponsors or partners of FPRI so that you can help us to put on programs like this, because today's conversation is over, but this conversation is just the beginning of a long conversation at FPRI about our place in the world. The world goes on, and we are here to talk about it, to explain it, to weigh and balance different ideas. And if you have enjoyed our discussion today, we encourage you to tell a friend, bring a friend next time, and join us again when we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.